to push it to get.
Thanks, Tim.
Oh, they're solid. I'll move that up.
Yeah.
So I don't have.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the State Board of Education's Committee on Virtual Charter Schools. We have an agenda. I'd first like to call the meeting officially to order, and then secondly, ask for a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
All those in favor of approving the agenda as submitted, signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The agenda is approved. We're starting today, and just for overview, this is we are intending to have a series of committee meetings per the resolution that was approved by the State Board to look into kind of the state of virtual charter schools in not only Indiana, but also learn from other states as to what they've experienced and what they have in place in terms of legislation and regulation, so that we can better regulate the virtual charter schools here in the state with the intent that we ensure that the students are receiving the best education possible. So we're looking forward to, over the course of the next number of months, looking into the landscape and the current state of virtual charter education here in the state, and then looking at some potentially, if it's required, recommendations to the state legislature as well as the full State Board of Education. So with that, I'd like to call, do any of my fellow committee members have any initial comments they'd like to make? No? Okay. Tim, we'd like to call on you to make a presentation about the current statutes and regulations. Tim is our State Board of Education legal counsel, so you're the appropriate person to address this issue. So thank you, Tim, for being here.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Before I begin, just a little bit of a roadmap about what I'll be presenting today. I plan to give a summary of the controlling statute, which authorizes the rulemaking for virtual charter schools, summarize the original regulations that were passed back in 2010, and then go through basically highlight a lot of the issues that states have identified as issues that are important to focus on, and what other states have done as far as statutory and regulatory work. And I promise I'm not going to make you go through all of those documents that are sitting on the table in front of you. Those are actually a sample of the research that I've relied on for identifying these particular focus areas. And I figured it would give you a very good summary of what the research is out there as far as virtual learning. So with that, the controlling statute here is Indiana Code 20-24-7-13, titled Virtual Charter Schools Funding and Reporting. And there's five main takeaways from this statute. First, it governs the funding formula for virtual charter schools. Second, it contains the reporting requirements for things such as classroom size, student-teacher ratios, and information required by the department. It also requires that virtual charter schools have a student engagement policy as well as a student withdrawal policy. As of July 1 of this year, it will have a new provision stating that students who are withdrawn from a virtual charter school may not re-enroll in that same charter school during the remainder of the school year. And then finally, and most importantly for what we're doing here today, the statute allows for the creation of regulations that govern the operation of virtual charter schools, which of course is what the board is responsible for.
Tim, if I may ask, what regulations has the board to date approved?
So there's only been one batch of regulations that were approved. Those are the regulations that I referenced earlier that were passed in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
And as I did allude to a moment ago, the statute is being updated July 1. There was some legislation that amended it in this last session, but really, aside from cleaning up a couple of things, the main takeaway was that the student withdrawal policy, or how they can't re-enroll. So with that, moving on to the original regulations, they were pretty limited back in 2010. They focused on providing definitions for things such as when the ADM count date would be, or what it means, or what a virtual charter school is, things of that nature. It made it clear that virtual charter schools are subject to the same charter school statutes that all charter schools are subject to. Also made it clear that virtual charter schools are subject to the standardized testing requirements in the state. The regulations require that virtual charter schools have various policies, such as defining what student access to staff would be, hardware availability, and technology plans. It also described the enrollment and attendance policies that were required. Specifically, enrollment would be based on providing educational services on a count date. Those students would be considered to be counted for that virtual charter school. And then It required that there be an attendance policy as required by the department, but it did not define any specific attendance policy at that time. And that's really what we had as far as regulatory guidance back in 2010. Before I continue on to the new focus areas that I think states have been really working on, and the field have been identifying as issues that are important to focus on. Are there any questions about the statute or the regs or any of those policies?
Are the regulations in our packet?
They should be. So there should be 3 pages with the statute. After the 3rd page, there should be, I'm sorry, it should be the 4th page. If not, I can certainly give you my copy.
Probably in here. Just give me a second, okay?
I'm not going anywhere.
Oh, it's the back page, just for everybody. It's at the very back of the packet. So, I mean, statute delegates the State Board of Authority to pass regulations regarding the operation of virtual charter schools. And just, you know, compared to, I'll just make just having read this, you know, compared to some of our other regulations that we've adopted previously, you know, this is 2 pages of regulations that the State Board has passed regarding the operation of virtual charter schools that is in addition to what's in state statute. So, just so, you know, if you don't have it in front of you, 2 pages of regulations, just for a frame of reference. Any other questions?
No, I'm writing some things down that I
Okay.
know.
Okay.
So with that, I'll continue to the document that's titled Memorandum, and it has a table of contents on the first page.
Okay.
So what this table of contents represents are the 10 areas of that states in the field have been focusing on in recent years when dealing with regulating online education. And of course, then there's the 11th provision, which is basically just kind of a catch-all of random things that I thought that would be things that the committee would be interested in reviewing or discussing. So the first one is kind of a no-brainer. Definitions. You always got to have robust definitions. As Mr. Henry just pointed out, the original regulations were pretty limited. They did not have definitions for things such as learning centers, which is something I'll discuss later, or concepts such as learning coaches. That's something that's become a very interesting and much discussed topic. Learning experts or online learning experts, and more detailed definitions of what a virtual program is. The statute, our statute provides that basically it's when more than 50% of the content is delivered online. Well, that certainly could leave some additional questions that need to be answered. I mean, there could be hybrid programs that make that 50% difficult to identify. So providing additional guidance for definition is something that many states have done, and of course I would certainly recommend we consider here during the course of this work. That takes us to the second policy item, attendance and enrollment. I'm on page 8, just for everybody. And this attendance and enrollment really means a vast number of things when you're talking about online learning, because it's about tracking students, when the count windows are, how many hours a day a student is permitted to learn, because some states regulate that. They say, well, a student can't learn, for 18 hours straight. They set maximum levels per day. So what a lot of states have focused on, and what I've done here is I've provided examples from other states. And of course, I haven't reformatted this language. I mean, it's the language pulled directly from those statutes, so of course not all the language is relevant. But Colorado, for example, is adamant that you have to be able to document that student's participation in the online program. And really most states, I should say, have some form of requirement that you can track and monitor student participation. Colorado is another one of those states that has the hour requirement, where you can only learn for so many hours in a day and so many days a week. I think Florida has an interesting example at the bottom of page 9, where the school district is actually responsible for working with the virtual charter school or that student has legal settlement to verify that student's attendance. So it's kind of keeping everything at a local level. I think that's a very interesting model. Florida's been doing a lot of innovative things. I think that's a good example of it. As far as enrollment, some states, such as Michigan and Massachusetts, have put a cap on the maximum number of students, percentage-wise, that can attend online learning programs. It's, right now, it's, for whatever reason, 2% is the favored percentage. I don't know how they came to that percentage, but multiple states have set that as the cap. Minnesota, I think, has another really innovative concept where they require parent approval. It's got to be documented that the parent wants the student in this online program. And then, of course, that opens up the possibilities like, well, if you're going to get parent approval, then that gives the virtual school, an opportunity to work with the parent to explain what this program really is. And I think that's one of the areas that everybody says is something that states should be focusing on, the idea that you are having involvement and communication with the parents, not just the students, especially in the front end. So
let me ask a question about that as it relates to the other states that have imposed caps. They're not anywhere close to that, are they?
I don't know if Ron has that information. I do not have that information with me today, but we can certainly research it.
Just for purposes of comparison, how many students do we have in virtual charter education today? Yeah.
Slightly over 13,000, I believe, was the answer.
Yeah. So, that's, in the grand scheme of things, compared to our total student population, that's fairly low. 1.2%, right?
So we would not be matching that or hitting that cap either. Yeah.
Right.
Did you find any states where they have actually had parents sign some sort of contract for supporting their student during their enrollment, or just really what you just shared in terms of they help submit the application that they're required to sign it? Is there any level of parent contract support?
So I'm not aware of a contract per se. That does not mean there is not anything out there. But there are some states, and I'll get to this a little bit later, that have I'll say they're stringent requirements as far as policies these virtual schools have to have in place as far as when they initially enroll students, the requirements that they have to basically have some sort of orientation program that is with both the parents and the child. So I don't know about a contract per se, but definitely many states are pursuing a much more active involvement on the front end. And Florida was an example where you actually have to have written approval.
So can you talk a little bit about what qualifies enrollment, when a student is formally enrolled in a virtual charter school? Yeah,
and of course it's not uniform across the board, but a number of states have now taken the position either in guidance, regulation, or statute that enrollment does not occur until a student has gone through orientation or some form of orientation. So that can involve some one-on-one time between a school representative and the student. Another part of the orientation that we're seeing come up more and more often now is basically a training session with technology. So making sure that the parent, the student understands how, that program works. How do you log in? So that's one thing we're seeing as far as a prerequisite for enrollment.
So that's, basically what you're describing is Indiana law, correct? For how we define enrollment?
Well, so the enrollment in the statute was a little more, I would say it's a little more vague in that it said that the student had to be receiving educational services to be considered enrolled on the ADM count date. Mm-hmm. But there's no additional definition there or what that means. So I think that's, an example of an area where we have an opportunity to expand that and give that some definition. Yeah. And the nice thing is, which is obviously clear from all the states that I'm referencing here, that we're not alone. I mean, this is happening across the country. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of states doing good work. I think great results, and I'm sure we'll hear from national experts as this committee proceeds that can discuss in detail how, which things are working the best and, what things maybe aren't working so well. So it's nice that we have that frame of reference. We have the other states we can rely on, that research we can rely on.
In crafting the 2% cap language, did those states give any reasoning for why they imposed a cap?
I believe they did. I do not have that information in front of me, unfortunately, but I can certainly research that and get you that information about how that percentage was ultimately decided upon.
Okay. Does anyone else on staff know the answer to that question? Why would they impose a cap? What reasoning would other states give for providing, other than? And this is speculation. I would guess that these caps are because these programs are so new, and that and many of these programs in states have been pilot programs. I mean, Indiana's program was initially a pilot program, and I believe it had a restriction as well when it was initially created. And I can't remember what the restriction was, if it was a percentage or if it was just a number of schools that were allowed to be created, or a set number of students. So I believe that's probably the basis, is that these are new programs and it's basically an opportunity to have a controlled test with a certain number of students and then basically modify the program from what they learn. But we will certainly research that further. So, sorry, I was checking my notes to see where I left off here. Next hours. Another, I would be jumping ahead there a little bit. I guess as a yeah. I know I interjected a
bunch. No,
so
that's
just
all right.
Find your place.
As far as enrollment and attendance, in addition to hourly requirements or minimum hours, some states such as Wisconsin also have a specific number of days that students must attend. I think that's something that would probably translate into our situation because students are required by Indiana law currently to attend a certain number of days. I think that requirement applies to virtual charter schools, but again, that's something that with regulations we can clarify and perhaps add some flexibility. I mean, that's kind of the whole concept with virtual learning is that, well, is there, can we meet that requirement but build some flexibility in with the regulations?
It seems to me like it's completely different than what a brick and mortar school would have in terms of attendance, because, and let the professional educators on the committee speak better to this than I can, but you measure performance by students actually attending school. And when you're dealing with virtual education, that might be a little more challenging to measure.
Yes.
You know, so, you know, what currently right now, as I understood the law, correct me if I'm wrong, how you measure attendance is delegated to the schools through a policy that they would establish. Is that correct?
Yeah, though the Department of Education can also impose additional requirements pursuant to the original regulations.
Okay. And have they done that?
I'm not sure about that. I'd have to confirm that with the department. But I guess one final note on the attendance concept is some states, and I think it's a trend that's becoming more popular, are requiring some sort of monitoring software where you can tell that the student has accessed the program, the classroom, the online classroom, and that can be tracked and reported. So that's something that basically, as the technology has developed, that's made tracking attendance a little bit easier. Which again, that's something we could certainly pursue via the regs.
So just a follow-up question. Sorry, I'm messing up your presentation, but student is enrolled, and for one reason or another, they're not engaged. How do they become unenrolled? Is that a decision that's made by the school? And what for the schools that are here in Indiana, what is qualified as unenrollment, or at what point would they take action to withdraw a student who may not be fully participating?
That's an excellent question. The way the statute is crafted, the statute, Section 13 that I started this discussion with, delegates the responsibility to the virtual charter school to have a withdrawal policy. The statute doesn't have any certain specific requirements for that withdrawal policy. However, there is nothing that would prohibit the regulations from identifying some requirements that such policies have to have. But as of right now, that's delegated to the virtual charter schools.
Okay. Just for a follow-up, I would be interested in knowing kind of, as of the enrollment date, what is over the course of the school year, what is kind of the track record in Indiana as to how many withdrawals there are compared to enrollments? So what's the withdrawal rate? And maybe some of the reasoning for why students are getting unenrolled. And before I continue, Ron, do you actually have that data at this time, or is that something we have to research?
I have some data related to that point.
Do you have a mic over there? For purposes of the home audience.
Yeah, of course, I appreciate it. I have some data related to that point today that doesn't get as granular as you're requesting. I think we have access to definitely data around cohort removal for high school, for sure, because they have to report when they remove those kids from a cohort. And then we can look with the DOE and work with them to get some more granular data at the lower levels.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? You're good? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Tim. Thank you.
That brings me to my third point on page 16, equal access, low income, special education, education learning students or learner students. There's as I referenced before, I thought Flores has been rather innovative in its pursuit of developing virtual education. And they currently have a statutory requirement that students who qualify for free or reduced lunches under the National School Lunch Act, as well as some other certifications, the virtual charter schools are required to provide the equipment necessary for them to participate in virtual charter schools. I don't know, unfortunately, the percentage of students that actually take advantage of that in Florida, but that really caught my attention as something where it seemed like the state was being very innovative and forward-thinking.
Well, it's kind of hard to participate in a virtual charter education if you don't have access to a computer or internet access.
Yes. And then New Mexico is another good example where by statute they require special education students be provided with the appropriate electronic formats and assistive technology to participate in virtual charter learning, or I'm sorry, virtual learning if they so choose. Those are only two examples, but I think those are two examples of states that have really started to think about how to integrate virtual learning and have it mature in their state and make sure that everybody has access to who wants access.
Are those really not happening in India?
I can't say one way or the other simply because we don't have the same regulatory and statutory requirements. That doesn't mean virtual charter schools aren't taking it upon themselves to have technology plans that incorporate that. As I mentioned before, virtual charter schools are required to have technology plans currently in Indiana, but it's limited about what that needs to include. So that's it's something that certainly that I'm sure as we move on, participants will kind of discuss their thoughts on that, but it's certainly something we could pursue as far as the Indiana regulations. That takes me to the fourth point, teacher requirements and student-teacher interaction on page 18. So again, citing Florida, I know I seem to always start off with Florida. They do require that their online instructional staff be state residents and be Florida certified teachers. That's not a requirement across the board, but I just cite that as an example of some states do require that there's two requirements, that the online education personnel be both state residents and be certified teachers in the state.
Is that not the case in Indiana?
I mean, we're still listening to these things, and part of why I don't have questions is because I just am shocked that we have questions about these things. Do you understand my question? Like, I'm shocked that that's not just an automatic.
Well, so if I may, so the licensure issue, as I mentioned before, virtual charter schools are subject to the same requirements as regular charter schools. So the licensure requirements for charter schools apply for virtual charter schools. However, I don't know if we have the resident requirement. I don't believe there would be anything in the charter school article 24 that would govern that.
So I could have my Indiana teaching license, but I could live in Ohio, is what you're saying?
I believe that is the case, okay. Yes. But at some point, somebody might correct me, but I do think that is the case currently.
So you're saying essentially right now, state of current law is as long as you have an Indiana teacher's license, you can teach in a virtual charter school, in Indiana, a charter school, a bricks and mortar, traditional public.
Yeah,
as long as you have
an
Indiana license.
With the state charter license requirements.
You could live in Louisville and teach in Jeffersonville or whatever. That makes sense.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. That's my understanding, yes.
Having the Indiana teaching license.
Right.
Let's see. Some states, such as Maine, require that virtual charter schools have a plan or policy that defines or allows for meetings with teachers and the virtual students on either some sort of regular basis or for basically field trips, outings such as that. It's not necessarily that it's required, it's that the policy has to address if there's going to be regular meetings or if there's going to be field trips, et cetera. Another thing that many states have pursued, such as Minnesota, is that the concept of a student-teacher ratio. Right now, in Indiana, the student-teacher ratio has to be reported, but we don't have a specific ratio limit, I don't believe. So it's documented, but it's not defined as what is the maximum.
What are the, in practice, student-teacher ratios in Indiana? And I'm more than willing to take a range because I know they probably differ from school to school.
I can tell you some states such as Minnesota, which I was just referencing, it's a 4:1 ratio. Though I know some states have considerably higher, such as 150:1. So I don't know if there's really much consistency there, but oftentimes states do decide that there is a limit that they're comfortable with. Let's see. As I briefly mentioned with the field trips and whatnot, a lot of states do have regulatory and statutory requirements in place requiring some level of student-teacher interaction, such as teachers basically calling students or their parents once a month. Sometimes it's required to be in person, but a lot of states have started moving towards this concept that there should be some level of personal interaction between virtual charter school educators and the students. And I'm guessing that's part of the reason why you're starting to see more student-teacher ratios defined as far as what's acceptable, because I mean, obviously if I've got 500 students in my class, that's pretty hard to contact all of them once a month. So there's just a practical element there. So I believe that brings me to item 5 on page 23. Physical locale learning centers. Learning centers, as I mentioned earlier during the definition section of this discussion, more and more states, and sorry if I just lost my place here. So North Carolina, for example, is a state that requires two things. It requires that the virtual school have both its maintain an administrative office in the state and maintain at least one testing center or meeting place within each of the 8 State Board of Education districts where the participating students reside. So I think that's a very interesting concept that North Carolina has pursued, and they actually did their own independent study. I can't remember when, and I think it might be in your packet, about virtual learning, where this idea that having an administrative office in your state, as well as having these learning centers, or whatever you want to call them, testing centers, scattered throughout your state, are key for virtual learning because, one, it ensures that you've got some of representatives from that school, that virtual school, in your state, and they're accessible. But also, especially the learning centers, some students simply need some actual hands-on help from time to time, such as tutoring, or as I mentioned, testing center. I mean, most standardized tests can be taken online now, but some students just work better in we'll say a classroom environment when it's time to take a standardized test. Having a physical location where they can, be given that paper test and allowed to take the test in that fashion. Some states, such as North Carolina, have found that's something to pursue and to require their virtual education programs.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, North Carolina did a study. They didn't necessarily implement all the recommendations in the study. I guess the other, I'll just make a quick editorial comment, and while we're reviewing other states, we're not necessarily looking to them as models. You know, performance has been challenging across the board. And so I don't think from my perspective, I'm necessarily, I want to understand the landscape, the current landscape, what we're doing here in Indiana, as well as what other states have proposed or have implemented in their laws and regulations. But by no means are those a guide or a model. I think we're here to learn and potentially craft some things that would really work to improve what we've seen as the performance issues that we've seen here in the state. So not necessarily looking at, you know, picking off every idea from, you know, states across the union, but because those, quite honestly, don't seem to have been particularly effective. But anyways, for what it's worth, that's my editorial comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, and no means is it supposed to be like, these are the things we have to be doing.
Absolutely.
It's, you know, it's, this is all part of doing the research, identifying the areas that states have begun to focus on, and the research is focused on, and what some states have done to try to address those areas of focus. But you're right. I mean, every state's different, and we all have our own unique challenges, and these are simply just examples from across the nation. That brings me to the 7th point, quality and operational standards for new and existing virtual schools. This is something that the original regulations that Indiana had sort of touched on in those policies I mentioned that they had to have, or that virtual schools had to have. As you can see from the material, some states such as Colorado have really listed or implemented a number of requirements that these virtual schools have to meet as far as having policies in place to address, you know, their technology plans, having, you know, an organization's vision and for that organization, define what their internet safety plan is, for example. Of course, that's always very important when you're dealing with kids and technology. Identifying and what their attendance policy is, how they track that information. And Colorado is by no means alone there. They actually do it in statute and reg. So they're, but you know, Florida again, they've got those requirements. Louisiana, Minnesota, Ohio are all examples of states that have, I would say, rather robust requirements as far as the policies school corporations have to have in place. I'm sorry, not school corporations, virtual schools have to have in place for when they operate or when they want to create a new school. I mean, I could go on and list the states that have that requirement. Indiana has that requirement. It's just how many policies do we want to define that need to be in place, and how prescriptive do we want to be with those policies have to, you know, allow for. One thing that did catch my attention when I was reviewing the states was that South Carolina has an operational requirement that 25% of the instruction must be in real time. That was, I'm not sure if they're the only state that has that particular requirement, but I thought that was pretty interesting that while we here in Indiana say, well, there's that 50% threshold for when you have go from being a virtual school to just a regular school, I guess, they actually mandate that that certain amount of hands-on time, and that's I don't know if that's something that will catch on, but I thought that was kind of interesting, worth noting. It's kind of funny, you know, they always say everything's bigger in Texas. Their operational requirements and quality review requirements are one of the longer statutes on this particular topic. That's my probably rather lame attempt at humor. So that brings us to item 7, school growth. And this is not growth in the sense of accountability, but whether or not states decide to implement restrictive growth policies on virtual charter schools. Basically, the concept of limiting growth to academic performance, saying that the school can only grow by, whatever percent if it's hitting its accountability metrics, for example. Michigan and Colorado are examples of states that have looked into that.
If you don't mind, I'd like to get back to the prior topic, because, and I think Carrie spoke to this at a board meeting some time ago, but you cite Florida having certain quality standards, et cetera, that as it relates to curriculum and standards. And I vaguely recall hearing that from one of our prior board meetings that a school did not have or did not adhere to the standards. Do you remember that? The Indiana standards? Is that, I assume that's a requirement under Indiana law as it relates.
So like curriculum standards?
No, yeah, curriculum standards.
Yes.
Like state standards.
Yes, yeah. Because virtual charter schools are subject to the same requirements as charter schools, the same curriculum requirements would apply to the virtual schools compared to the charter schools, regular brick and mortar charter schools. I'm guessing Ron has something to add there.
Yeah, I can't validate the claim, but I can say that during the discussion of Hoosier Virtual Academy, when the board was considering its options for applying sanctions on that particular authorizer, the conversation around whether or not Hoosier Virtual Academy's online curriculum was 100% aligned to the state's, to Indiana's academic standards did come up. Once again, I can't validate it individually that is true or not, but it was part of that conversation. You are correct.
Right. Sorry, I interject on that.
Oh, no, that's what we're here for, right?
Thanks.
So then the final couple of topics I've got here, school reporting, assessment and accountability requirements. Well, the Indiana regulations touch on these issues to some extent. The fact is, most of these requirements already apply to virtual charter schools, just given that those requirements apply to traditional charter schools, brick and mortar charter schools. So, the same data reporting requirements that's there. I mean, there's actually some additional requirements, as I mentioned earlier, such as the student-teacher ratio, and of course, assessment and accountability. All of those requirements they apply to virtual charter schools as is. That doesn't mean that the committee might not be interested in pursuing additional requirements for those topics, but those are topics that are, to at least some extent, currently in place, just under the existing statutory scheme for charter schools. The last item is funding, and this is something that states have have pursued in a number of ways. But there's an asterisk here with funding as far as Indiana virtual charters go. All the funding is defined by statute. That the statute I actually started this discussion with. So the board's ability to really craft any kind of regulations that pertain to funding are pretty limited, if they can do it at all. Just given that those regulations cannot contradict with the statute. But I've included it because it's something that a lot of states have pursued as far as, trying to find what's the best fit for funding and ensuring that these schools are being properly funded and that the money is being used in the way that states want it to be used. So that's the final main policy item I've got, though I did include a couple of other items starting on page, yeah.
Can you talk about the funding how are virtual charter schools funded, and just elaborate a little bit more on those points.
So based off the statutory formula, I believe my understanding is that virtual charter schools receive approximately 90% of what a traditional charter school would receive as far as state tuition support. Of course, with the addition that the enrollment calculation is done a little bit differently with virtual charter schools, but the total amount I believe is about 90%. I don't know if there's any. Okay. But then, so kind of just last items, things to think about, great discussion topics, hopefully. Some states such as Colorado make it clear that virtual charter students need to have access to certain extracurricular activities. Minnesota is another state that touches on that. It's kind of the sort of the big one that I've noticed that while it doesn't seem part of a virtual education, that's something that states want to make sure that students have that ability to have some ability or some avenue to pursue those types of activities.
How would that work for a virtual charter school? I mean, you were not talking about participating in extracurriculars of the district school or the public school where they live. We're talking about extracurriculars provided by the virtual charter.
Actually, I think in Colorado, it's the former, where the student has a right to participate in extracurricular activities in the school district where they reside. I don't know if that's how, I'm not sure if that's what Minnesota does, but that's, I believe, the Colorado model. But again,
I mean, the way it reads to me, and based on the language from Minnesota, is that it's the enrolling district.
yeah,
So that would be the virtual charter school,
Yeah.
correct?
yes.
So.
But I think this is a good example of, the only restriction is, the board's imagination. I mean, if there is a concept that the committee and the board find to be important and something worth pursuing, say the word and we will do the research and pursue that and tell you if other states have done something like that, or if we can be the first state to do something like that, and the pros and cons with such a program like that. And that's really why I listed these things at the end. It's just to kind of think outside the box. Like it's not all just about tracking attendance and enrollment. There are probably ways of utilizing virtual charter schools that states just haven't even thought about. And I hope that we get to hear about some of those ideas when we have outside speakers come and present to the committee. Because I'm a novice when it comes to virtual charters, and I know there's a lot of experts out there who probably have just brilliant ideas.
Yeah, I mean, just from my perspective, I'm less interested in I'm more interested in the curricular programs rather than the extracurricular programs. I'm not too concerned about the tennis team of the virtual charter school. So more worried about what happens in the educational component, but thanks.
So that concludes my initial summary here. I welcome any questions. I know we've got a couple of questions that we need to do some research on. And this is all, I just want to reiterate, this is all very high level, examples that some states have done, but every one of these things, the devil's in the details. So it's not like, well, snap your fingers and let's make it happen. It requires some research and planning. But it's really, I just wanted to give the committee members an opportunity to consider some of the programs that other states have been doing to address these issues.
It just seems like there's a lot of different ways in the states, just what I'm reading through a little bit here, on how they give jurisdiction over who the enrollment attendance areas are. And so, like the one I think I saw in here was that the state board districts were also the charter districts, the virtual charter school districts. Did you see a lot of different ways states have designed how the schools can run? That's like a little sticky point in terms of the foundation of how they operate, a systems approach.
So are you asking a question about, I just want to make sure I'm answering the question you're asking me, whether or not states have pursued creating virtual schools that operate in less than the entire state, or am I totally missing your question?
I just want to make sure I understand in our state, so we'd have, like Wayne Township has their own, correct? Doesn't Wayne Township have a virtual charter school?
No, they have a virtual school, which is unique from virtual charter school. Charter schools, as defined in law, have statewide boundaries in the state of Indiana. So to the extent that they curtail their boundaries, they do so as a local LEA, choosing to do so.
So I think that's what I need to understand more about, the boundaries and what are the options and what other states have done to create. Who can
So the
apply
difference
those?
between virtual education versus virtual charter education, is that what you're saying? Okay.
And I'm not sure if I'm prepared to answer that in depth today, but we can certainly research that a bit more. Any other questions?
You know, at some point in the meeting, I think it would be helpful to take some public testimony. I don't know what my fellow committee members think about that, but I'd be open to injecting that at this time, just for public feedback on the what's been presented thus far. Would that be acceptable? So I know this is somewhat informal. We didn't have a formal public testimony at the beginning of the meeting, but if there are members of the public who would like to speak briefly as to what has been presented thus far, as to the what's been discussed, other states, et cetera, I think we'd be open to
What they're currently doing to address some of these things.
we could take that testimony and so I would propose a 3-minute testimony per person, and if we feel like it needs to go further than that, we can certainly extend that. But
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
Perhaps we take a 5-minute break, which will allow people to sign up if they want to come up here.
okay, let's do that. So we'll do the staff will do a sign up, and we'll take a 5-minute recess and adjourn until 2:05. Thank you. Okay, let's call the committee meeting back in session here. Okay, so we have one person who signed up to speak. So we'll welcome John Hammond up to the podium. Very good. Yeah. Thank you.
And Mrs. Wicker, I presume, will be back in the room at some point, but she's in the back of the room, actually. Yeah, my name is John Hammond, and I represent K-12, which is an education management organization that's involved in virtual charter school work here in Indiana. I want to introduce, and I'm not going to speak, fortunately for you, but I am going to introduce Mary Gifford, who is our policy director. And I think our attempt here is just to speak to some of the questions that were raised with Tim and with Ron. And Ron has a presentation coming up, and a lot of that will be answered. Just to kind of set, have a level set, if you will, for Mrs. Wicker and others had raised some questions about how does this work in Indiana today. We'll try to be as factual as we can. We're not going to be advocates today. We really do want to listen and understand where you're coming from and be a resource down the road. But with that, I'll just briefly introduce Mary, and she'll have a few comments.
Good afternoon. Good to see you again. Mary Gifford from K-12. Yes, I usually use that educator voice. Sorry. I'm Mary Gifford with K-12. I'm the director of academic policy for the company across the country. We operate about 40 plus in 40 plus states with charter schools and some with district schools. So some of the things you all talked about are very important distinctions, and we're really glad you're starting to think about those distinctions. Very happy to be a resource as you go through this. I formerly served on the State Board for Charter Schools in Arizona, which had oversight over 550 charter schools and went through a very laborious rulemaking process for virtual schools. And so I am very empathetic to the task in front of you and glad that you're undertaking this. Happy to work with staff on some follow-up things, the origin of caps, enrollment caps in the different states. Those came about mostly because we looked at states that had virtual charter schools for the longest period of time, like Pennsylvania and Idaho, and they never had more than 2% penetration. And so that 2% cap became kind of the threshold out there. So there are some really good rationale behind some of these things. Some comments real quickly on special education. I would just say that particularly our schools in Indiana and any charter school in the entire country does have to provide access to all. And so, you know, we have to consider the least restrictive environment, whether it includes assistive technology and things like that, and follow the federal special ed regulations and serve those children. Same thing would happen for free and reduced lunch eligible kids, even if it isn't explicitly in statute to provide what is necessary for students to access the curriculum. You have a requirement as a public charter school in every state in the country to do those things, and we would do those things. Teacher requirements.
Yes, sir. Back real quick on that point. So if a student applies to a virtual charter school and they do not have access to technology, even internet, what do you do?
It's more frequently than you think, Mr. Hendry. It really happens quite frequently, and not just for students with IEPs or students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch. You have homeless students who apply. So we provide the technology in most states. It's permissible. In some states it's required, but generally it's most certainly what a responsible school would do, is you would provide a stipend for internet, you would provide the actual computer. In certain states like Ohio, attendance for virtual charter schools may not start until you sign, a parent signs for a computer issued by the school. The Constitution in Utah, for instance, requires that in grades K through 6 you must provide everything needed for instruction. So that would be a computer for a virtual school. So it really is what you would do as a responsible school, is bring the school to the child, which is part of the flexibility of virtual education. If that requires assistive technology for special needs students, if it requires computer, if it requires ink and toner, if it requires paper for printing things off, if it requires the actual computer, internet subsidies, those are the things that are provided.
So just so we can get a sense of what that means to you, out of your enrollment in the state of Indiana, what percentage would you say access that kind of support?
I would be venturing a guess. I'd like to get you some specifics
Ballpark?
on that. It would probably be in the ballpark of 30 to 40% of the students availing themselves of some of those things out of economic need, and then between 10 and 15% depending on the grade level for special education status or 504 accommodations. But we're very happy to talk with you about any follow-ups and work with the staff. I love the compilation of the different states and any color we can provide or any background, any of those things. Very happy and very eager to work with you guys during this process.
Can you address the Indiana certification?
Yes, so, you know, as I think as Mrs. Wicker noticed, that as a charter school, we have to have Indiana credentialed teachers, and so that is the case for most charter laws in the state. There are some charter laws that do not require certification, and then it would be up to the school to follow whatever the state law is for charter school teacher certification. But most state laws do require that, in Indiana most certainly, and we would hire only certified teachers. And beyond that, it becomes, you know, for special education students, they must have an appropriately certified special education teacher. High school teachers must be appropriately credentialed in the content area in which they're teaching. So it would really follow the state laws for anything related to credentialing.
What would require, and I'm not talking about all schools, but just your schools, what would cause you to withdraw a student from your enrollment?
That's a great question. The legislature enacted a law that we actually were very supportive of, and we're trying to get enacted in other states. It's a wonderful law in Indiana regarding engagement. One of the things you heard about, South Carolina compelling students to participate in 25% of their instruction live or in real time with a teacher. Typically what happens is the students who most would benefit from that live instruction or real-time instruction don't show up. And in a virtual setting, I can't, you know, grab them by the collar and drag them into the classroom and sit them down. So the Indiana law permits the schools to have an engagement policy and actual consequences. The policy needs to articulate what a school will do to engage students and the student's response, and if after availing themselves of everything they do not engage, they may be withdrawn. And so there is kind of an escalator process that would go through additional supports and requirements after first noticing a student isn't appropriately engaged, ultimately then withdrawing. Outside of that, you know, there are typical truancy hearings that as a charter school they may conduct if there are behavioral issues or things like that unrelated to engagement. But the unique law in Indiana is really quite fabulous and allows the schools to compel the students to engage in instruction with teachers.
Are there circumstances where a student would not attend regularly or participate regularly and not be withdrawn per a policy?
It would depend. The law is really flexible in Indiana and allows the schools to develop a policy that would fit for their school. It could be that there is a student who is doing very well and doesn't need a whole lot of engagement, and maybe that student would not be the student who has to attend a required session. I think the benefit of the way the law was constructed in Indiana is the schools can truly personalize it based on the student's needs, as long as there is clear communication about the expectations. And so that becomes the important part, is making sure it's clearly communicated in policy.
So you have an engagement policy in your Indiana schools?
Yes, sir, we do. This is the first, we just concluded the first full year of implementation under the new law, as did the other schools. So the law allows the school to develop a policy, have their local school board approve it, and then have their authorizer approve it.
Okay. Maybe the staff could collect some or all of the engagement policies just so we can take a look at those.
It's really a model. It's a fabulous model we're trying to replicate in other states, and I hope you get to showcase it a little in your proceedings.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Mary.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Okay, moving on to, thank you for that participation. Appreciate that. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda. So, Ron, if you would come to the podium.
Thank you, Mr. Hendry. My mission for today is to provide an overview of virtual charter school specific data for the state of Indiana. I took some nuanced views, but the purpose of today's presentation is to provide an overview and give you a sense of different ways we can break down and analyze the data to inform any outcomes from this particular committee. So I encourage you, with that as the mission, I encourage you to stop me at any time to either ask clarifying questions or to ask for additional information or different analyses of the same data.
You know you don't need to say that.
I do want to start off with the teacher ratio information. I was able to pull that from the annual performance reports that are submitted by the schools. The average teacher to pupil, certified staff to pupil ratio across the 4 virtual charters that operated in 16-17 was 60.5. However, that average was heavily weighted towards Indiana Virtual Academy, which reported a ratio of 122 to 1. Of the other 3 schools, Hoosier Virtual, Indiana Connections, and the Inside Academy, the average was around 40. So you can kind of see there.
And when you say 40 or 122, that's just all staff?
Certified staff.
Certified staff. So that's not necessarily a teacher ratio, is it?
It is not necessarily a teacher to student ratio. However, it is the only ratio reported in the annual performance reports. And I'd be happy to dig deeper, but yes.
Other than teachers, who else would be included in that?
I think you would have any principal certified administrators. Some schools might have a special education director. We can dig into that number a little bit more, but given today, it came up, I wanted to use at least self-reported data for now. And then
That's
we
helpful.
can dig
Thank
further.
you.
Absolutely. So we'll start off, and you have this packet in front of you, so the data on the screen is already coming up a little blurry, but you have it in front of you, so please feel free to follow along. Virtual charter school enrollment in the state of Indiana has increased each year, other than one dip between 13 and 14 for the past 8 years. The total enrollment has doubled in size over the past 5 years. That is a result of some new schools opening, but really a result of just additional interest in the programs, as most of the new schools that have opened have been spin-offs underneath the same organizer, operating schools with the same operator. So when we dig a little bit deeper into 17-18 data, you see the breakdown across all of the virtual charters operating in 17-18. There were 6 virtual charter schools operated in 17-18, 3 of which opened within the past 2 years as specialized schools, as I mentioned, operated by existing management organizations. For the most part, the virtual charter market has been led by 3 operators in the state of Indiana: Connections Academy, K-12, and a virtual charter overseen by the Daleville School Corporation. And currently, as my research shows, all of the virtual charters operating today are operated by one of those 3 organizations.
Are there additional schools that are opening in the 18-19 school year? Do you know?
Tim, this would involve Nineveh.
I don't think that's a charter, is it? Yeah, sure.
So as you mentioned, I don't want to belabor this because we talked about it briefly, but charter school in 17-18 charter school enrollment represented 1.2% of overall public school enrollment. As you can see, over the past several years, it has outpaced statewide enrollment increases. So it's increased the percentage of students enrolled in the public charter school, doubling within the past 4 years, similarly to overall enrollment. So that's kind of general information. This next slide is something that I think reflects some of the nuanced analyses that we can do. So using kind of geolocation data for each school corporation that is sending a kid to a charter school, we're able to determine that there is a student enrolled in a charter school from 288 of the 289 school corporations in the state of Indiana. I did not identify that one school corporation. And as you can see by the size of the circles on your map, the number of students from each corporation is really relative to the size of that corporation. So Indianapolis Public Schools has the most students with legal settlement within their corporation enrolled in a virtual charter school, and then it kind of goes on, really basically follows what our largest school corporations here are in the state of Indiana. So I thought that was a unique view, and happy to dig in further if you have additional questions about the geographic location of students. And once again, those dots reflect school corporations, not individual student addresses or anything like that. So I failed to mention this when I started, but some of the data presented today was provided by the Department of Education, this table being one of them. So this presentation, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, is a collaborative effort between the state board staff and the DOE staff. You have a copy of their full report in your materials as well. But they went in and they looked at where the students are coming from. And both in 1617 and 1718, which will be on the next slide, the majority of students enrolled into a virtual charter academy, excuse me, a virtual charter school from a traditional public school setting. I think it's worth noting that the last column, without explanation, can seem somewhat concerning outside of Indiana school system. This group can contain several kids. So a student that was enrolled in a private school, well, sorry, non-public is up there, but a student that came out of homeschool and enrolled in an online school would be captured in that particular category. A kindergartner enrolling for the first time in education would be captured in that category, or even a child that moved here from out of state. So I want to make sure it's clear that that doesn't mean that kids are enrolling from all over the country. It means that those kids previously just weren't enrolled in the Indiana school system, and there's multiple reasons, as you can imagine, why that would be the case. The Insight School is the only school on here that had the majority of their kids coming from another virtual school, but I think it's important to point out the context, as came up in the conversations with Hoosier Virtual. The Insight School was a spinoff that was specifically designed to meet students with more significant needs, a higher touch program, if you will, for those kids. And as I look here, they actually have one of the lowest teacher to student ratios, or certified staff to student ratios, as would reflect the model. So the majority of those kids came from Hoosier Virtual. Similarly here, the same exact trend. Indiana Virtual Pathways Academy was a spinoff of the Indiana Virtual School, which is largely why the majority of their kids came from another virtual school as opposed to a traditional school corporation. So shifting a little bit into one of the more nuanced analyses, and Mr. Hendry, you mentioned this. I'm talking about enrollments and withdrawals throughout the year. I said I didn't get as granular as you were asking. However, I was able to compare fall ADM count dates in 1617 to spring ADM count dates in 1617, and I was able to do that for multiple years, as you can see on the chart. Virtual charter schools are the top 4 schools that operated in 1617 when this data was available for the number of kids that were student increase, right? An increase in enrollment from the fall count date to the spring count date. And it really wasn't even close. As you can see, Hoosier Academy Virtual School went up 83 students. And the next nearest one was 31 with a state average, and that's a corporation average, of losing 15 students, I believe.
Can you explain what is the, is this a year by year? Maybe I'm not reading this bar chart.
No, you don't have a key. It is a year by year.
So 29 is, I'm presuming, 14, 15?
Hang on. So 29, so it's 16, 17. I apologize because the numbers should have correlated with a year. Yeah. So the large drop in Hoosier Virtual was a result of the state board's actions against their authorizer, and then subsequently their local organizers' actions to not renew the charter. So yes, this is annual, and the last column is 16, 17. So if you take out the drop of 412 students, Hoosier Virtual's average was not 83, it was actually 249 students, a gain of 249 students on average from the fall to spring count date. So this gets to a little bit about when students are enrolling. So we know where they're coming from. Now this kind of paints a picture about when they're enrolling in each virtual charter academy. And again, this is happening at a far greater rate than the traditional school corporations across the state.
So it seems that for all the schools except Hoosier Academy Virtual, that they experienced kind of fall to spring growth.
Yep.
Is there any reason for that, in your view?
I think it's a good question. I could only speculate, and I think the challenge in speculation is that I have to put myself in the minds of all the parents who chose at any point throughout the school year to withdraw from wherever they were coming from, majority a traditional public school corporation, and enroll in a virtual charter school. I think it's an interesting question about when. So all we have is a count date in September and a count date in February. So your question about the nuance of when this is happening, I think is really important. If it's happening traditionally right after the first semester, that says something. If it's happening just after the fall count date, but those kids are staying through the spring count date, that says something else. So I think further analyses of that information based on your previous request, I would want to do that before I posited any potential claims. But I do think it's important, and I also think it's important when you look at this next slide, which was provided by the department, which talks about how the average tenure of a student in one of these virtual charter schools across the state. So you have 17 and 18 data, and this data was based at the beginning of the school year. And as you can see across all the schools that were operating in both years, the majority of students are enrolled for a single year. And now this gets into some of the things that we heard when we were investigating Hoosier Virtual, which is that virtual charter schools serve a range of needs when it comes to parent choice. The star athlete who goes to school online because they need a flexible schedule often gets talked about, but sometimes it might be a single mother who is moved from her home and needs an immediate option for her kids while she resettles, or a single father for that matter. Let's be equal on both ends. And so it's just a short-term solution until things get figured out. And that's what this data does show, that it is a short-term option, no matter what the need or why that's the case. The data shows that it is short-term for the majority of students.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's another question. Yeah, I'll speculate, and I think the people who can answer this are the parents. So I think what we heard when we spoke with the Hoosier Virtual Academy parents was that sometimes, if their child was in a difficult situation, whether that be related to bullying or whether that be related to a relationship with a particular school teacher, they needed to remove that child immediately, but they didn't have the time or the capacity to come up with a long-term plan. And I think that a lot of our parents are concerned about the compulsory attendance laws in this state, and they want to make sure that they simultaneously maintain the safety of their child and address the immediate needs of their child, but also don't put themselves in legal jeopardy. So I think a lot of families that we spoke with, when we talk about only being enrolled for 1 year, talked a lot about those temporary drop in, and kind of not drop out, excuse me, that's the wrong term because it's loaded, but then withdrawal once things get figured out. Additionally, as we'll see on the next slide, a lot of this, it contributes to the fact that kids are enrolling in 12th grade. So when you look at Indiana Virtual Pathways Academy, which is a new school this year, the overwhelming majority of their students, the median is 12th grade, so that means half of their students enrolled in 12th grade into that school, even though it's a 9 through 12 school. As you can see, Indiana Virtual School, 6 through 12 school, over half of their students enrolled in grades 11 or 12. So when you dig into this data and you see the increases from fall to spring, and you see when kids are enrolling, you really start to grapple with the role that these schools are playing across our state. Now, that doesn't mean, I think at the end of the day, we're all committed to all kids getting an excellent education. And if that's not happening, we don't just allow something to continue to go on. But when we look at that individual 1-year enrollment as a median, when you look at these numbers of kids enrolling that late in their educational career, it kind of lends some credence to those numbers as well. Again, table provided by the department. I can't stress how helpful they were. So the averages are there, but the median, I think, is more important with this particular data set because basically, in a K-12 school, if the average is 9, you could have all kindergartners and all 12th graders. But when you actually look at the median, what that tells you is over half the students in that school are enrolling at that grade or higher, and that grade or below. So when you see a median of 10th or 11th grade, you really see that a lot of the students that they're receiving are coming in late on in their educational careers.
This is some really interesting data. I think I'm interested in drilling down a little bit more and understanding whether the data we have in front of us relating to median or average consecutive years at 1 or 2, is that a function of enrollment at late stages of high school careers, or is that kind of the more temporary, finding some base for a year, continuing studies, and then exiting to another option, whether it be public or private or something else? Can we get some information on the I don't know if you have any data on, and actually this may, just thinking about it, you may not, but the reasons for withdrawal?
We can certainly check into it.
I know we'll have data on withdrawal rates, but do we have any insights, whether it's documented or just kind of, these might be a list of reasons why. But if I'd be interested in knowing whether a material percentage are leaving virtual to go back to public. So maybe they are homeless, or in a period of family, there's custody issue, or they're in foster care or something like that. And is this a temporary measure to continue one's education, and then once a stable or more permanent family location or situation is stabilized, then they're re-enrolling in a public school district, for instance?
So I'm confident that once a student enters a high school cohort, if you will, in order to remove that student from a cohort, the school must report on a list of codes, and it's probably not as granular as we want, but we can at least get it for the majority of students, as the majority of students who are enrolling are in high school. So we can see whether or not they transferred to another school, or whether they went to homeschool or a dropout, or what that is. And I think I'd be happy to reach out to any of the operators who would be willing to share some aggregate data about students in general, to see if they're tracking that. And I think it would be a best practice, and I'd be surprised if they weren't tracking that information. So I'd be happy to reach out.
We could know from ISTEP data, the number of students who qualify for ISTEP data have to be there 162 days. So we could know what percent of their students, were there long enough to qualify for that. Because if they're there 162 out of 180 days, they were there a majority of the school year. So we could know what percent of their students actually took the ISTEP and qualified for score. That would help us to know, if only half their students qualify for their ISTEP score, then that tells us only half their students will be there a majority of the school year.
That's exactly right. And I think we can absolutely get that. And I think it's a really good point that you raised, because the enrollment numbers we're looking at today, because of the transient nature, are not likely reflective of every student that is captured in their accountability. You're absolutely correct. And we'll definitely look into that, and I'll get you a percentage of the enrollment that is captured in accountability. So moving along, we'll dive into some demographic data. Here, I listed the years. I apologize for not doing that on a previous slide. 4 of the 6 virtual charter schools in the state of Indiana are at or above the state average for students qualifying for free and reduced lunch in this current school year, 17-18. Indiana Virtual Pathways, Hoosier Academy, Indiana Connections Academy, and the Insight School of Indiana. Indiana Virtual School was reported to be above the state average in 16-17, but the overall percentage dropped significantly in 17-18 according to Compass. I was unable, sometimes Compass data is a little off, I was unable to confirm if that was 100% accurate. And I'll dig in a little bit more to make sure that that reflects their current student population. Moving on, 3 of the 6 current charter schools operating in the state of Indiana have at or above the percentage of students with special needs, the state average, if you will. And remember, they're enrolling students from across the state, so there's really no reason that any particular school, there's no, I guess, material reason that any school would have a large dramatic difference. So any difference here can just be associated with parent choice and choosing whether or not they want to enroll in the particular program. But special education enrollments, like I mentioned, in 3 of the schools are higher than the state average. So some parents are finding it to be a feasible option for their children.
For all of these, if there are material changes year over year, if you could advise us as to if there is any reasoning for that.
Yep. So, for example, the middle Hoosier Virtual is the blue column, dropping from 17% to 5%.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
I will put that on my list to reach out. And lastly, 0 of the 6 virtual charter schools enroll greater than the state average of English learners. It's hard to predict why. I think I would posit that the state average for English learners is largely driven by dense populations of English learners, either in urban centers or in refugee resettlement areas. And so the fact that these schools enroll kids from across the state, they're not pulling from a concentrated population of English learners. But that's just a guess for me. It also just could be because of awareness, or just because the options aren't what's meeting those students' needs. So hard to guess here, but this is the one area where the virtuals are significantly lag behind the state across the board. So a terrible transition from enrollment to performance, but I did want to provide just a high-level overview of some performance. I've already got one note, Ms. Wicker, to capture what percentage of students that are enrolled in the school are included in their accountability measures. What you see on this slide are ELA proficiency rates from 15-16 and 16-17. The shift in assessment came in 14-15. 14-15 was basically the lowest performance in several years here in the state of Indiana. So we focused on 15-16 and 16-17. All the virtual charter schools in grades 3 through 8 lag behind the state average. Indiana Connections Academy is the closest. However, every single virtual charter school demonstrated improvement for proficiency between 15-16 and 16-17.
Hey, Ron, just on a couple of these slides, these are great, by the way. And I know you gave a geographic representation based on the school districts they were coming from. Mm-hmm. Can you break that down further, some of this data a little further on, like for geographic, urban, suburban, rural, mm-hmm. And then a little bit more demographic information. So male, female, racial. Mm-hmm. I know we have English learners here,
yeah,
so any other demographic information would be helpful, just so we can get a picture of the representation of this current student bodies.
Happily.
Thanks.
So math performance in grades 3 through 8 from 16-17 to 17-18 is a very similar story. All of the virtual charter schools lag significantly behind the state average in both years. However, every single virtual charter school operating both in 15-16 and 16-17 demonstrated improvements in their math performance. Insight School was open for the first year in 16-17, and therefore they do not have comparative data. And the last piece, and I think this is important because growth is really it captures a within year performance as opposed to where a student, where you're receiving a student, right? Proficiency is highly contingent upon where the student comes in at. So all of the virtual charter schools were in the bottom 11th percentile statewide for academic growth in grades 4 through 8. This is the total growth points, so combined ELA and math. Similarly to proficiency, every Indiana virtual charter school improved their growth from 15-16 to 16-17. However, they still, like as I mentioned, lag significantly behind the statewide median of 98.4. So you can see where the gaps are. Again, Connections Academy.
I want that again, that number, because I guess
Yeah.
my thing is, I'm a believer in growth and the accountability system. That's why I like including growth in it, because, give me the child who comes to me, who's, didn't have the home that we all want our children to have, and I'll take them wherever you need me to take them.
Yep.
But, so what was the statewide average in growth?
Yep, it's 98.4.
98.4.
Yeah, you can. And then I will say, Carrie, to your point earlier, this data includes every single student that was tested at the school. So what I can also do is I can run this data, which, as I'm reflecting right now, I probably should have run this data for students that were enrolled 162 days and update this presentation for you.
Because if we're looking at the number of students who are moving in and out that we're talking about a large percentage of students that were not counted.
Yep.
And so those students don't count for their home district, they're also not counting for the virtual charter schools. And so those children's data, in essence, is lost. And, and I understand why it's lost, because they haven't been in any one place long enough for anybody to get counted. But at the same time, to me, then those children probably didn't do well. And I hate to make that assumption, but then, then that, and that doesn't, I'm not blaming the charter schools on them. I'm just saying those are even more children who are behind and that we need to worry about.
What percentage would you say are falling through the cracks there?
I did look this number up. I can easily get it for you, but I would hate to even estimate. But I have their accountability data that I can literally pull and tell you how many kids took the test at the particular school and how many kids counted. I can't tell you how many kids were there, left, and took the test at another school very easily, but I can give you a clear picture of
How many took it there
and are counted.
and are counted. So
How many just took it and were not counted at all?
that's what he's saying.
Oh, across the entire state? That's an interesting question.
But, if they had, I'm just a ballpark, if they had 1,000 students and only 500 counted, those 500 that didn't count,
That's exactly right.
the data's lost, but there's 500 kids who correct.
That's exactly right. So I'm going to kind of speed up a little bit here. High school ISTEP, so grade 10 ISTEP, is a little bit different story. The virtual charter schools have actually outperformed the statewide average. The state average dropped significantly when these tests were first introduced, as you remember, as you likely recall. So Indiana Virtual School actually outperformed the state average in ELA for the grade 10 ISTEP in 2016, dropped significantly the subsequent year, but still the averages for Indiana Connections Academy are far closer to the statewide average in high school, which, as we mentioned, this is when the majority of students enroll in their particular school, than was for 3 through 8. Math ISTEP 10 is a different story, and as you can see, the statewide average, even for this test, is nearly 20% lower than the English language arts portion. I think we're having a lot of kids being tested on standards that they've only learned in 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. They haven't had the opportunity or the privilege to be instructed on these new standards since kindergarten, so we kind of have an institutionalized gap that is creating some issues, but needless to say that the virtual charters lag significantly behind the state here on this significantly more rigorous exam based on the outcomes across the state.
Well, to that point, the difference between the state average and these schools' performance would not be affected by that standards adjustment.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
They lag behind. Absolutely not. They lag behind the state. They face the same challenges as everybody else. That is absolutely correct. And the story is similar for growth in high school as well. The state average for high school growth points in 2017 was 100.4. The median was similar. All virtual charters lag behind the state average for high school growth in 2017. It's the first year we've had high school growth. That's why you don't see historical data there. And then for high school specifically, all virtual charter schools fell within the bottom third percentile statewide for high school growth. And when I say the bottom third percentile, that number is based on the accountability number.
I think this is an important point. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we're having these conversations. You know, as it relates to growth, to your point, you know, I think there's room for improvement.
And I'll make sure you have the numbers for, I want to confirm that the numbers include that we have all the students plus just the students who were counted in accountability, just to be fully transparent and, to be honest, fair to those schools. So next is the four-year graduation rate. Again, all the virtual, this is a really hot topic, I think, with virtual charter schools, given that we know that they enroll a significant number of students after the beginning of the school year, significant relative to the state average, and that the majority of their students in multiple schools enroll at 10th grade or later on. However, when they enroll those students, they immediately enter into their cohort. So the graduation rates at these schools lag significantly behind the state average for four-year cohort graduation. I think this is an area where we can dig a lot further, and I'd be happy to do so based on any guidance you have, because I would intuit, based on the data that we've seen, that these schools are receiving students late on in the game and being held responsible, which I think they should because they accept the taxpayer dollars to do so, being held responsible for getting them caught up. And I think that, so I think how we look at grad rate for virtual charters is really important, not to make an excuse or anything like that, but to just fully understand the cohort data that's being reflected.
But you said, you know, one of the main reasons why the attendance is only, you know, median 1 to 2 years tops is because a large number of the students are entering the virtual charters late in the game. So are you saying that the failure to graduate is because they are so far behind already when they join in 11th grade that they could attend for 2 years and still not graduate just because they haven't met the standards?
That is a concern that we regularly hear when analyzing graduation rate data for virtual charter schools. I have not done the analysis, and I think it would be a helpful one to look at the overaged or underaccredited students that are enrolling. However, based on anecdotal feedback from the operators and from school leaders across different virtual charter schools, we do hear that when they do enroll the 11th and 12th graders, that they are more often, I wouldn't say more often than not, I would just say disproportionately when compared to other students across the state, overaged or underaccredited.
Well, I think, you know, a lot of these, you know, all of this is very important, but I think this is probably one of the more important points because that's something that's been in the public discussion as it relates to graduation rates. And I think we have to be fair to the virtual charter schools to fully understand why that is and not just assume that, you know, hey, they're just not graduating kids. So let's understand the reasoning behind that. You know, maybe there are multiple reasons for that, but I think we should understand that better. So I'd really like to dive into that issue further.
And I'll work with the department to come up with, because I think there's so many analyses that you could do here to come up with some ideas and see what capacity they have, and then we'll kind of come back with a more robust deep dive into graduation rate data specifically. I put this slide up again, but we just spoke about it. I will say for the 5th year graduation rate, which is reflected in blue here, the virtual charters do have a greater percentage of 5th year graduates, if you will, than the state average, likely largely driven by the fact that so many students enroll late on in the game and so few students compared to the state average graduate on time. So there's some just aspects of this that create a situation where they should outperform the state on 5th year graduation, but I do think it's worth pointing out to say that to the extent that is reflected here, the virtual charter schools in our state are working with students beyond 12th grade to ensure that they meet the graduation requirements at likely largely fill credit deficiencies in a 5th year, if you will.
talk about the fifth year? Because, I'm sure that the two board members to my left and right understand this a lot better than I do. But if a student wants to attend high school, they have fallen short of the requirements and they want to attend an extra year, how does that work in Indiana? Because I just don't understand that too well.
Mm-hmm. I don't have all the details, so I would say that I'm just going to describe generally, and I can get back with you specifics. But I do believe that there's a 12+ category on the real-time enrollment and ADM count reports. So if you look on Compass, enrollment data is broken down K through 12, and there's a 12+ column. And I think, so high schools, if the student chooses, can opt to keep that student enrolled for an additional school year to make up credit deficiencies. I can get specific code sites that limit that by age, if there's any limitations regarding age, or if it has to be a 5th consecutive year, can you leave and then come back? And I'd be happy to work with Tim to get those code sites so we really clarify that 5th year for you, and see if there's anything that's unique about the virtual charters for a 5th year, which I don't think there is, as it relates, than there would be for a traditional public serving a student in their 5th year. Because this is work that all of our schools do. I want to make sure I do point that out as well. This is work that all of our traditional high schools do as well, working with those students in a 5th year to help them get across the line. I want to make sure that I don't sell them short at all. So these last 2 slides will go pretty quickly because they're directly from the Sboe evaluation of charter school performance in the state of Indiana. We reported in that evaluation that every virtual charter school in 2016 and 2017 received an F rating based on Indiana's accountability model. Based on the data we looked at today, you can kind of understand some of the dynamics there, largely driven in most cases by the graduation rate that really has a negative impact on their overall letter grade. And then finally, Tim hit on this, but I said I would mention it, and I want to make another point based on a previous slide. So virtual charter schools receive the least amount of per pupil funding in the state, and I want to talk specifically about some funding streams that they don't qualify for. So the 90% piece is only for the basic the basic grant. So every student across the state gets an amount. But then the state starts adding to that whether or not the student has special needs, whether they meet a complexity requirement, receive SNAP or TANF benefits. So they have full access to all of the additional grants, right? But they only receive 90% of the basic grant. As reflected here, the little green line is shorter than everybody else's green line. They also do not have access as a charter school to the Charter School Innovation Grant, which was a $500 per pupil grant put into the budget, I believe in 2015, to help charter schools offset the fact that they cannot levy property taxes. So virtual charter schools are not eligible for that $500 grant, which then leads into the last funding stream, which they're not eligible for, similarly to all charter schools across the state, which is levied property taxes for transportation, facilities, capital improvements, and then debt service, and some is allocated towards technology. So that all contributes to virtual charters receiving significantly less per pupil, and that number is in that evaluation. And the last piece I think is really important as we switch to one count date. So moving forward, Indiana has switched back to one fall count date for ADM. Virtual charters, as we've seen, have historically had a dramatic increase from fall to spring count date. So unless that changes, and I think we can all think about the motivation. If you have 2 count dates, you're a lot more motivated to recruit more students. I'm not saying that that won't take place, but I do expect that number to drop a little bit. But it's safe to assume that shift is going to disproportionately impact our virtual charter schools and put them in a position where they are educating more students that they are not receiving funding for than the traditional school. As you saw in that previous slide, the average for a traditional school corporation across the state is minus 15. And the greatest increase for any school corporation across the state was 31 additional kids. That was determined to be a negligible amount. We went back to one count date, but for these particular schools, 400 kids is not negligible when tuition support is around $9,000 a kid.
What incentive would you have as a virtual charter to enroll a student after the count?
And that's what I was going to say. Their window is their choice. So, at that point, correct? Is the charter not allowed to say this is our window for enrollment?
No, charter schools in the state of Indiana, as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, must maintain open enrollment up into their agreed upon grade level caps with their authorizer. So every single charter school sets a threshold for enrollment And I'm not sure, I have to look at the approved charters for each virtual school to understand what those were. But basically, if a student shows up and files the enrollment paperwork, according to Indiana state law, the charter school must accept that student at any point unless that particular grade level is at its max.
That makes sense.
And I imagine that these schools, they can take on a lot of students, right? They don't have the same issues as a traditional brick and mortar, which has just facility issues, right? We can only take so many eighth graders. I imagine that their caps are pretty high, and they basically have to enroll any student who comes through the door and completes the necessary paperwork and processes. So I wanted to flag that as we look at this last slide related to funding, because I do think it's important as we look through this and think through it. And a lot of other states, as Tim mentioned, are looking at how these schools are funded. So I did want to close the loop there. So any questions, and I have all your notes from throughout the presentation, and we'll make sure we get to work on that before the next committee meeting. But anything else?
I think we're good.
Thank you all very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know, I'm going to turn it over to both of you if you have any further comments, but one thing I'd like to ask the staff to do is make sure that all the documents go online so that they're accessible, that we're going to be reviewing. And from my perspective, I think this was really helpful just to kind of drill down a little bit onto kind of the landscape that exists right now as it relates to virtual charters. I think there's a lot more information that we still want to delve into, a lot of questions, but I think there's more that we need to look at. So we'll probably, as we set the next meeting's agenda, I would anticipate that there may be some points that we want to revisit that were covered today, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But you know, in terms of next steps, you know, I'd welcome your input, fellow committee members, on what you think. Is there any information that you would like to receive as to kind of the current state of the laws here in Indiana, or the kind of the practice of Indiana virtual charters that haven't already been raised today?
I do. First of all, thanks, Ron and Tim. You guys did an excellent job. This is a lot of information, and you made it about as easy as it can be, which is not very easy. So thank you so much. I did wonder a little bit about what do we know about successful virtual charter schools? Are there any exemplars out there? Is there anything to study within any schools that are positive that we can learn from? That would be a question I would have.
So one recommendation. So moving forward, one thing for the committee to consider, I know eventually, and we talked about today, we want to look at bringing in some national experts, which I think will get at your question, Dr. McMahon. In terms of next steps at the next meeting, we can come back with answers to your questions and dig deeper into some of the data that we discussed. In addition, we can also look at bringing in authorizers of virtual schools that could also help answer more specific questions. So.
I think that would be helpful to know what the authorizers are currently doing in the state of Indiana, because a lot of what it sounds like is in Indiana they have the freedom to set their own policies. And so what are their current policies that they're following? And are they following them because they're following them in another state? And so that was something they were used to doing, and since they had the freedom to choose to do it here, that's what they were doing. Or were they doing it because it worked in another state, and that's why they were implementing it here, or were they just doing it because they had no other guidance? So it would be very helpful to talk to the operators as to why they have the policies in place that they have.
So, I think there are a number of issues that were raised today that we'll want to continue discussing and digging into further. I'm interested in a few things. Number one, not just virtual charters, but perhaps we could also talk or have an agenda item on virtual education generally. And then I think we want to understand what the challenges are for the virtual charter schools that have been operating in our state for a few years. What are the major issues that they're dealing with? And then I think, either at the next meeting or the meeting after that, maybe we would have time at the next meeting, but I think we should be hearing from some national thought leaders on virtual education and virtual charter schools, whether that's NASB, National Association of Charter Schools, other kind of policy making or governance in K-12 education organizations. And I think, we will be getting to, and perhaps this is in the next meeting, is, kind of in coordination with what are the major issues that are being faced by virtual charter school operators. Some of that is self-assessment, but some of it is just, from an operational standpoint, what would make sense, how to improve how we do things here in Indiana. But I think we'd like to hear from staff as to where they feel the gaps are and where we should focus some of our attention as a committee going forward. So maybe that's just identification of major issues. I think we all kind of have a sense of that, but we'd certainly like some further identification and analysis as to where state board staff feels there may be gaps or opportunities for us to look into. Obviously, there's been legislation that's been proposed, but we can certainly look at that. But and again, not looking for recommendations at this time, but more identification of issues so that we can further understand the landscape as well as investigate what the current state of virtual charter education is here in the state and nationally for that matter. And then I think there's other things to discuss, but we can reserve those for future meetings. So I think just from our standpoint, we are planning to do monthly meetings. So we'll have a July meeting and then kind of continue on that path. So there'll be an agenda that'll probably be put together in the next couple of weeks or so for the next committee meeting, and we'll take it from there. David, one of our fellow state board members, is here, David Freitas. Open the floor to you since you're a member of the board. Is there anything that you would like to see, and if so?
Thanks for the opportunity. I think there's many issues that you're going to need to tackle. And as I mentioned in the break, it's sort of like drinking out of a fire hydrant at this point. There's so many issues. I would suggest the committee look at identifying broad areas such as finance, such as curriculum, and then start to, under each category, list issues that you want to tackle. And then maybe staff could bring forward experts in that particular area. Like curriculum is a huge issue. Accountability is a huge issue.
And so right now, I'm getting the sense there's so many issues, where do we start? So I think if we structured it in a way by category and then start to put together issues under each one, then the public can come forward and add issues to that, and then we have a plan going forward. And as you address each one, you could tick it off and show progress along the way. So thanks for your great work. I'm glad that you're tackling it, and look forward to recommendations coming forward to the full board. Thanks.
Do you have any further comments? No?
All right, well, I think today has been really helpful for me. Thank you to the staff. Thank you to the public who commented. You know, we've got a lot of work to do in the coming months. We know that. We're excited about it. It's an important issue. And you know, we're committed to addressing some of the issues that we've seen, some of the challenges that we've seen in virtual charter education and virtual education for that matter, here in the state. So we're enthusiastic about tackling these issues, and felt today was a good first meeting. Still trying to get our arms around the landscape, but we'll get there and move forward. So without further ado, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Eleven and 12th grade.
My questions are on consent. What is the goal of this? I guess what I think that's too is, what's the goal of this?
Hi.